And how often would you say that people present themselves, perhaps they're worried or convinced that they're facing either a possession or an oppression? And how often would you say that you can rule that out, and it's would you say it's more commonly a regular mental illness that can be treated in conventional ways? Or
I mean, that's not uncommon, especially and it's why psychiatrists are often very skeptical, because we'll see people who say have schizophrenia and they'll complain of voices. But to a skilled doctor, you can make those differentiations. I can do it fairly easily, so I'm confident that the vast majority of cases I can distinguish between mental illness and psychological problems. Although there is sometimes an overlap. I mean, a person could have both.
Would you say there's a particular type of person that faces this kind of diabolical attack? Would you say there are risk factors or things that make that increasingly likely to be the case?
That's a good medical term, risk factors, because it also does apply to demonic attacks. I mean, I always tell people possessions don't just come out of the blue. There's a history to it. And in addition to learning the signs and symptoms, just as you would a medical illness, you also have to take a good history and learn why this may have happened. So, for instance, in the case of the Satanist woman that I talked about who was possessed, talk about a Faustian bargain, right? She got in over her head. She knew she was possessed, and she wanted to get rid of it. But she obviously was possessed because she had turned to Satanism. But then there are other ways of people getting involved in the occult. Trying to manipulate people, or trying to act like you can read the future. People involved with things like channeling spirits. I mean, that's really why people emphasize, as in the movie The Exorcist, the Ouija board, because the Ouija board, to some kids, it's just a game, but at its heart, it's meant to contact the spiritual world. And it does seem like in rare cases, I'm not saying it's that common, people do get a kind of response. Otherwise, this thing would have died out, So people who turn to the occult and/or people who turn to evil. So I write about a case of a guy in the book who was a drug lord, and he was a criminal. He had not only turned to a type of Satanism called Santa Muerte, Holy Death, but he claimed that he got great results from it until he didn't. And then he was imprisoned, and after a lot of success as a criminal. And he was found in prison by the prison chaplain to be possessed. He got some help, but he eventually left prison. He was still possessed, because sometimes these cases take a while. And he really worked at it. He turned back to the church. He had been baptized Catholic, developed trust and prayer in our Lord, and he was eventually completely delivered. Whereas, by contrast, the Satanist woman I wrote about, that they're going to make this movie about, was a tragedy, because she was scared of the cult, and she really didn't want to leave the cult because she felt she had certain paranormal abilities, which she felt she got from Satan himself. So she was never liberated. Eventually, she died. It's a good segue into defining the paranormal. The paranormal is basically a modern term. It arose in the late 1800s because people were curious about these phenomena that eluded materialistic science, like channeling spirits or encountering ghosts and stuff like that. And basically, the so-called paranormal is a modern secularist attempt, sometimes even by religious people buy into this, of what in past eras we called spiritual, either spiritual in a good sense or spiritual in a bad sense. I found it interesting that the Satanist woman that I've been talking about, her name was Julia. I learned a lot about Satanism from her. I don't feel it's anywhere near as ubiquitous as people think it is, but some people, certain subcultures. But I asked her if she thought she was gifted because she had these kind of psychic abilities. She could even see people at a distance. That's something parapsychologists called remote viewing. She knew all about people's lives. She knew how my mother had died, for instance, many, many years earlier. And I said to her, "So you think you're gifted?" And she had what I think was a good response, a very orthodox response in some ways. She said, "No," she said, "Dr. Gallagher," and she was very respectful to me, and she always told me she'd tell me the truth. She said, "Dr. Gallagher, no one is gifted." She goes, "We get these gifts from someone else." She goes, "In my case, I get them from Satan. There are certain spiritually gifted people who may have spiritual gifts from God, but they don't get it from their innate ability." The head of the International Association of Exorcists is a very written a lot of books too. He always says these parapsychological people are all fooled because they don't know the powers that they're really dealing with.